Hi, my name is Mansher Bajwa, and today I will be discussing my topic for the World Issues Summative, which is about global food scarcity, hunger, and malnourishment. My inquiry question was, how can developed countries assist and take action against global hunger, food scarcity, and malnourishment in the third world and developing countries? First, let's begin with the introduction. In order to better understand this topic, we must first identify what it exactly means. Global hunger and food scarcity are periods of time when people in countries are facing severe food insecurity. Food insecurity is the inability to obtain necessary amounts of nutrition for the entire population. Malnourishment is a result of global hunger and food insecurity, and it is a deficiency in nutrients. Based on data from the United Nations, almost 821 million individuals in the world were left undernourished in 2018. According to the United Nations, 2 billion people do not have safe, regular access to food. This, along with the previous fact mentioned, there are millions and billions of individuals alive today that do not have a safe access to nutrition. This obviously causes several health complications amongst them. With this being the case, global hunger remains to be unequivocally one of the world's most pressing issues. Now, let's move forward to discuss the geographic relevance of this topic. Hunger and malnutrition is significant in the most poverty-stricken countries and countries that are victims of geopolitical issues. According to the Canadian Medical Association Journal from 2009, more than 1.02 billion of the world's people were left undernourished. Geographically, there are particular regions of the world that feature the most amount of malnourishment issues, which we'll explore as we go on throughout this presentation. After careful analysis, we can conclude that most of the world's undernourished populations exist in the sub-Saharan African regions, with their populations consisting of 30% and higher malnourished and undernourished individuals. However, Africa is not the only place where you'll find severe undernourishment. In places like North Korea and Haiti, you can easily find the same population levels of undernourishment, reaching above 40% of the entire population. These countries require rapid assistance, and if they don't receive it soon, they could be at a high risk of death. Based on this graph or map, we can conclude that some of the most undernourished countries in the world include Haiti, Burundi, Chad, Central African Republic, Congo, Uganda, Zimbabwe, Zambia, Madagascar, and North Korea. As I mentioned earlier in my analysis of the map, a pattern that is immediately identifiable is that many of these countries are part of sub-Saharan Africa. These countries are highly underdeveloped. Now let's discuss some of the major stakeholders in this world issue. The major stakeholders for world hunger can also be identified as the Big Five. They include the Food and Agriculture Organization, or the FAO, the International Fund for Agricultural Development, or the IFAD, the World Food Programme, or the WFP, the World Bank, or WB, and the Consultative Group on International Agricultural Research, or the CGIAR. These stakeholders work on providing safe accesses to food for various undeveloped countries, such as I mentioned earlier, Haiti or Burundi. Influential factors of global hunger from a geographical perspective can be recognized as border disputes, wars, and other issues that may influence food insecurity and malnourishment. For example, Yemen has a major famine issue due to political and border disputes, and many have died due to malnourishment in that country. Now let's discuss some of the geographic concepts and topics that affect the issue of world hunger and malnourishment. So primarily, development is a major topic and factor that can be applied to the situation, as many underdeveloped countries have the highest rates of malnutrition, hunger, and food insecurity. There are clear indicators when identifying underdeveloped countries, and in this case, the countries with the most food security have longer lifespans, lower infant mortality rates, and higher calories consumed, which for developed countries would be the complete opposite. Now let's take a look at an example. 73.4% of Burundi's population is malnourished, according to Global Citizen. Due to this, Burundi's average lifespan is only 60.9 years. Comparing that number to Canada's 82 years of average lifespan, which is a significantly higher amount, we can see just how underdeveloped Burundi really is. So, as I just explained, based on the data, there is a clear lack of development in countries like Burundi, and can prove to be dangerous in the long term, especially as global food sources begin to decline and populations increase. Another geographic concept or topic that affects this issue is globalization. This is due to trade, alliances, and a sharing of information that creates much awareness and assistance to countries ravaged by malnutrition. For instance, the international organizations and stakeholders have the job of creating awareness around the world through social media platforms, carefully analyzing and working with the governments to stabilize and focus on food security issues as much as possible. This wouldn't obviously be possible without that globalization factor and those connections that take place across the world. So as I mentioned earlier, many of these organizations, such as the Food and Agricultural Organization, exist solely due to globalization and seek out to assist underdeveloped nations with help from developed nations with better economies. These organizations were established for the purpose of providing global assistance to countries around the world that require it. Lastly, another geographic concept or topic that affects this issue can be identified as geopolitical factors. Geopolitical factors are also important when discussing food security, as some places such as Syria and North Korea are suffering major famine and food insecurity due to political factors. Syria, for example, is caught in the midst of a civil war, whilst North Korea is under a totalitarian Stalinist or communist dictatorship. Politically, these are some of the most powerful impacts on world hunger, and the United Nations as well as developed countries must find ways to eliminate as much malnourishment around the world as possible. If political issues like this continue to fall in the way of world hunger, many will be at risk of death. Let's move on and talk about some of the social, political, environmental, and economic factors that influence global hunger. First, let's talk about some social factors. In terms of the social factors that influence world hunger, many families and individuals in developing countries realize that they could not rely on agricultural sources alone for their food production and consumption, especially as populations began to increase in size. According to Peter Uven, author of The State of World Hunger for the University of Pennsylvania, this brought upon a methodological inclusion of politics and anthropology, and a move away from exclusive stress on agronomy and economics. As was presented in this quote, a greater reliance on the government for the purposes of creating social and humane policies regarding hunger and malnutrition was required, and still is to this day. Whilst this does exist in developed countries and their societies, many third world countries have less rights and focuses on these anthropological policies. Now let's move on to the political factors. Uven continues to quote, they, or the government policies regarding human resources, include, among others, primary health care, basic education, nutritional supplementation, food price stabilization, anti-famine policies, and low military spending. The government involvement in many countries has made considerable changes to policies in order to create better political systems in which previously mentioned factors, in Uven's quote, are well incorporated for health purposes. However, more governments around the world, especially in third world and developing countries, must adopt these values in order to better their own population. However, in third world countries where hunger is most prominent, the government is most often unstable and politically weak, which requires many to produce for themselves. This requires political governance on a global scale, according to Mary Boyle Struble and Lori Lindsay Aomari, who are the authors of Position of the American Dietetic Association, addressing world hunger, malnutrition, and food insecurity. They go on to quote, "The problems of world hunger can appear so great that they sometimes seem approachable only by way of worldwide political decisions. Worldwide efforts to overcome hunger, food security, and malnutrition and to foster self-reliant development must be intensified. Thus, we have the incorporation of organizations such as the UN and UNICEF to assist with such tasks. However, even with them incorporated, we must augment the offers and the help and the assistance provided by such organizations." So as I mentioned earlier with some of the geographic concepts that apply to this world issue, border disputes and geopolitical conflicts such as the Syrian war are just some of the other political aspects that are causing issues in terms of ending global hunger, as they are creating famine and leading to a population that is severely malnourished. Now let's talk about some of the environmental factors. The environment plays a major role in terms of food production and hunger. According to Struble and Aomari, globally, growth rates in crop yields are declining, but even optimistic scenarios require a doubling of food production within the next generation to keep up with projected population growth. Efforts to overcome these constraints often degrade the environment and conflict with the longer-term sustainability of agriculture. This is unequivocally true, especially due to the fact that with increasing emissions and pollutants, our environment has been deteriorating and climate change continues to damage the atmosphere. Tim Dyson, author of Prospects for Feeding the World, states that regions may benefit from climate change, and this may help explain the recent series of good monsoons in the Indian subcontinent. Although rapid climate change would clearly be disastrous, the slower changes generally projected may have only a modest effect on aggregate food production worldwide. So though climate change and other such products of natural variability may assist in augmenting food production, it is definitely temporary as an effect, and is not sustainable for large periods of time. As each day passes, we continue to contribute to global warming, which accelerates it further. Let's move on to the economical factors. Economically, food can be and is often tremendously expensive for families to afford in developing and undeveloped countries. More recently, due to the COVID-19 pandemic, a global economic decline occurred. According to, and please excuse my pronunciation for the following names, Efrat Shadmi, Ying Yao Chen, Ines Durado, Inbal Farhan Perak, John Furler, and Peter Hangoma, authors of Health Equity and COVID-19 Global Perspectives, quoted, "The global economic downturn and limited international support puts millions of people in low and middle income countries at significant risk to being food insecure. With many families affected by such a turn of events, governments have been trying to provide effective funding." With all the negative effects that the COVID-19 pandemic has had on the populations of the world, many governments have tried to subsidize the residents of their country. In Wuhan, China, for example, where many patients were affected by COVID-19, government subsidies were able to cover many costs. Similarly, in Canada, the CERB checks are another way of essentially subsidizing the residents of the country. Governments must be prepared to assist their population, regardless of the circumstances such as the COVID-19 pandemic. This is not a thing or a factor in third world and underdeveloped countries. According to the American Diet Association, economic viability for food is the biggest expense for a poor family. Mothers believe that if they breastfeed infants longer, the money saved on supplemental foods can be used to feed other family members. Fuel to prepare food is also expensive. This is true as food and essentials for many families are difficult to purchase in third world countries due to higher prices. These prices must be lower in order to suffice for many of the families. In order to do this, the GDP of the country must be higher, and we'll talk more about this in the action plan. That's a great segue into us discussing the action plan. Let's talk about the action plan background in order to gain more context. There are various different prospects to feeding the world. According to Mary Boyle Struble and Laurie Lindsay Aomari, authors of Position of the American Dietetic Association addressing world hunger, malnutrition, and food insecurity, they quoted, "Such declarations, which in this case global organizations against hunger, and goal setting inspire optimism and specific action toward resolving complex challenges. On a global scale, they, which in this case is global organizations against hunger, foster both collaborative work and productive competition. This means that global organizations must continue to push directives in order to shine a light on the issues related to world hunger and create competition. They must allocate funding from various sources, such as donations and more, in order to lower malnutrition. But reducing hunger also requires other tangible resources. The costs are real, but so are the costs of failing to act. In most cases, micronutrient deficiencies can be ended with low-cost, readily available nutrition interventions. For example, salt iodization, iron fortification, vitamin A capsules, and more, according to Struble and Aomari. This means that many lives can be saved using such methods. However, this too may prove an issue to acquire for certain least developed countries. In this case, the UN and WFO must be responsible and provide funding for such measures to be taken. In addition to this, one of the most important methods of making a positive difference in world hunger is to create programs and systems with least developed countries to educate parents and individuals regarding proper nutrition and how to care for children, which is something very similar to my action plan. Now let's move on to the actual action plan. For the purposes of my action plan, I decided that I must procure a plan that will contain the most powerful, accessible, and achievable goals. The first step of the action plan is to create the most sustainable method possible for food production, as well as to identify how countries that are most affected by hunger and malnutrition can resolve the issue themselves. For this purpose, the most optimal plan of action on a local level would be to educate the children, adolescents, and adults through community-led initiatives in countries that require the most assistance for malnutrition issues. The necessary content that they would need to be educated about would consist of strengthening parents' knowledge about behaviors for feeding, care, and health of their infants. In addition, programs to monitor child growth, the distribution of micronutrient capsules, fortification of foods such as salt and dry milk, initiatives to improve access to clean water, and programs that encourage baby-friendly clinics and hospitals are incredibly important for the individuals residing in these regions. With this, adequate knowledge about agriculture and farming is also quite major in order to develop sustainable food production within the communities. So, for example, it would kind of be about how to manage the land and how to manage the environment when doing any agricultural activity. That is the kind of knowledge that we would have to bestow upon farmers in these third world countries. On a national level, the first steps would include the government planning of food production, infrastructure development, and subsidies or funds for the population. In order to do this, the country must first obtain a high GDP, which would mean that it should establish better trade systems, less obstructing tariffs, and more opportunities for economic alliances and investors. For example, countries like Zimbabwe, an underdeveloped country, can trade important natural resources such as coal, diamond, gold, iron, and more. These are all resources that Zimbabwe is rich in. They can do this by ramping up production and creating more employment opportunities for residents. This can then be traded on a global platform, especially through the outlook of more commerce opportunities such as e-commerce, a method that is used by many to purchase materials and items today. With an income of large amounts of funds, Zimbabwe can implement it into their infrastructure and food production in order to primarily relieve malnourishment. Then, after acquiring enough funds, Zimbabwe can import food and essentials that it cannot efficiently produce domestically. Keeping funds and subsidies for families that may require it to a great extent and for unexpected periods of time are significant to sustain a successful and healthy population, as that money can be used to not only purchase food but help families survive. Finally, on a global level, many organizations and countries must allocate funding towards these underdeveloped countries and provide monetary aid as often as possible. According to Struble and Aomari, at present, governments of most foreign aid donors and developing countries do not give high priority to reducing poverty and hunger. Additionally, developing country governments may divert donated funds to other activities. The quantity and quality of aid falls short of its hunger-reducing potential. For example, foreign aid amounts to less than 1% of the US federal budget. Instead of utilizing valuable funds for other purposes, governments must ensure that any amount of monetary value that is provided for the purposes of ending hunger must only be used for that purpose. For this reason, strict guidelines regarding the donation and utilization of funds must be set in place for both the country that is contributing money and particularly the country that is receiving the money, in order to eliminate chances of corruption. Organizations such as the International Fund for Agricultural Development, or the IFAD, must assist nations in developing agricultural land instead of allowing them to take control of the money, especially without adequate supervision. This is important as many of these countries, especially in sub-Saharan Africa, are affected by controlling powers that have been responsible for abusing government powers, taking government funds, and acting as catalysts for the war. So a lot of war-related individuals. We live in an age where the aspects of globalization, such as information from different countries, can be viewed simply through our devices, and recognition for various issues can then motivate positive changes. Fortunately, there are well-established organizations operating for this purpose. So globalization is also a major factor when it comes to relieving or alleviating global hunger on a global level. Modern day globalization, especially technological globalization, allows for a flow of information, providing more recognition to the world issue. How would I measure the progress for the action plan? Well, in order to measure the progress of the action plan, I will be analyzing how malnourishment and hunger rates have changed. For example, if the ideas of more agricultural activities and more education towards healthy nutrition are proposed, then realistically, there should be a positive output in the nation's malnutrition rates, even if it takes the course of a few years to determine. These facts can usually be determined through yearly United Nations reports and general population and demographic reports from the country. Now it's time to ask you a question. After reviewing this presentation, as world hunger increases, what would you focus on as a major stakeholder or organization? Would you look for temporary yet rapid solutions such as providing funds and importing food? Or would you support more sustainable solutions such as agriculture and farming? Now I am going to answer my original inquiry question, which was, how can developed countries assist and take action against global hunger, food scarcity, and malnourishment in third world and developing countries. So in a quote by Struble and Aomari, fortunately, food aid reaches millions of families worldwide and represents approximately 1/3 of the annual budget of the U.S. Agency for International Development. Developed countries such as the United States have already made efforts, as was shown in the quote, to provide food aid in third world countries through their International Development Fund. However, countries must invest more towards global hunger as it continues to significantly affect society. And if climate change gets worse, it is very possible that millions and even billions may not have food available to them in the near future. Assisting other nations can be beneficial for economic purposes as well. It will create alliances and powerful trade systems, so natural resources pertaining to those areas can be acquired by developed countries in return for funds and growth for those undeveloped and third world countries. Now it's time to ask you another question. If you were the leader of a developed country, such as Canada or the United States, what are some initiatives that you would take to help other undeveloped nations? What responsibilities can you bestow upon your populations and citizens, as well as residents, for the purposes of contributing to the issue of world hunger? Let's review some of the additional research pertaining to my topic. So, according to Struble and Aomari, 33% of children under 5 years in developing countries are stunted, which means they're malnourished based on height for age, indicating long-term cumulative effects of inadequate nutrition or poor health. Struble and Aomari's research suggests that 27% of children aged 3 to 5 years in developing countries are wasted, which means they're malnourished based on weight for age. Struble and Aomari quoted, "Impairment of growth can have both immediate and long-term negative effects on a child's health, ability to learn, potential for future achievement, and risk for the development of chronic diseases later in life." Finally, according to Struble and Aomari, Sub-Saharan Africa continues to have the highest proportion of undernourishment and also has the largest increase in number of undernourished people. But the situation in Africa is not uniformly grim. Most of the increase took place in Central Africa, driven by the collapse into chronic warfare of a single country, the Democratic Republic of Congo, where the number of undernourished people has tripled. So essentially, warfare was a cause of much of the malnutrition and undernourishment, as well as hunger in Central Africa, as well as throughout the sub-Saharan region of Africa. Now, after watching this presentation, you're probably wondering of ways that you can help at home. And here are some of the ways that you can not only learn more about world hunger and malnourishment, but you can also donate funds and assist these organizations. These organizations include the World Food Program, Food and Agricultural Organization, World Bank, and International Fund for Agricultural Development. And these are just a few of the major organizations. There's many more out there, including initiatives from UNICEF. So with more research, you can obviously find more ways to help. On social media, if you have any social media accounts, you can raise awareness for the Yemen famine, for example. You can sign petitions, and there's a lot that you can do online as well. In conclusion, global food scarcity, hunger, food insecurity, and malnourishment are one of the largest issues that plague our society to this day. Around the world, many communities are negatively affected by this issue, especially those that are based in third world and developing countries. We must work as a collective, as one group, as one whole entire world, in order to fight against this issue and find a proper, adequate, sufficient, and sustainable resolve for future generations. If we don't, then millions and billions of lives are at stake. Thank you for listening, and watching my presentation.